So you have this decade-long bill that's designed painstakingly with lots of stakeholders to set America on a path to harness and boost the growth of new technologies and clean energy. But that was $370 billion. That one storm just caused $110 billion of damage. Different metrics, obviously, but it puts it a little bit into context of like, man, this climate thing's costing us some real dollars.
Welcome to the world-changing podcast.
Was that too much? Yeah, that was probably too much. But let's keep it. We'll keep it anyway. How about this? If we do the podcast and the world doesn't change, then we can take that out. Welcome to the world-changing podcast, where we deconstruct the projects and products that are moving us towards a decentralized and carbon-free future. We'll talk to skeptics, supporters, and innovators in the fields that depend on electricity to run their industries, which is changing every single day. I'm your host, Greg Robinson, co-founder of Aston Labs, a decentralized infrastructure company. And on the other side of the camera here, we have Flo Lumpson, our producer, and she will make sure that the train stays on the tracks while we do this.
We are thrilled to have Julia Pyper on the show this month. Julia began her career covering clean energy as a reporter in DC, a senior editor at Green Tech Media, and a staff writer for E&E News. Her writing has been published in HuffPost, Scientific American, and the New York Times. She went on to work with clean tech accelerator New Energy Nexus, where she supported the California Sustainable Energy Entrepreneur Development Initiative, CalSeed. Today, Julia is Vice President of Public Affairs at GoodLeap, a fintech company focused on accelerating the deployment of sustainable home solutions. She's also the creator and co-host of Political Climate, one of my favorite podcasts on energy and environmental policies. In this episode, we talk about the relationship between public policy, regulation, and innovation. Julia helps me understand what virtual power plants are, and of course, we talk about how our childhoods lead us to where we are today. Please enjoy.
Okay, does this sound any different to you guys?
A lot different. Yeah.
Yeah?
Really?
Can you hear the microphone now?
Yes.
Yeah, the microphone. Yeah, I can hear the microphone.
So
Great.
just so you know, we usually just do like a running start. The first place to always start, I think, always informative, is where'd you grow up?
Yeah. Where'd I grow up? I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Canada, and then grew up mostly in an area called Milton, Ontario. So it's like an hour and a half outside of Toronto, a big city most people have probably heard of. But it gets pretty rural pretty quickly in Ontario. And so we actually had a farm where we had a bunch of horses and we bred horses. And my, jobs were always cleaning stalls on weekends, and it's Canada, so it's cold, and like walking out to fields with buckets of water and your fingers are falling off from the ice, and riding around on tractors. And my brother still works for a tractor company today, Kubota. And so that was kind of growing up. I don't know if it was torture or not, but my mom was like worried about the horses' hooves, right? She didn't want them to get damaged. So one of my jobs was literally roaming all over 25 acres of pastures, picking up stones so the horses' hooves didn't get damaged. I'm like, cool, thanks. It was like manual labor of like the worst kind. I'm like, it's very meditative, grabbing a heavy stone, putting it in a wheelbarrow, shuffling along. That was my life. The horses came first, although I think my mom still loves me.
That's amazing. I think I shared when we first met that I grew up on a dairy farm, and we had, at the beginning, we had rock picking, which was a thing kind of similar to what it sounded like you were doing, which is like this manual thing. And then eventually, and we'll probably in some of our conversations talk about like tools and like how tools can be applied to make things go faster, namely in the clean energy space. But like in farming, it was amazing just in my childhood to go from rock picking by hand to like these giant machines that would pick an entire field that you just towed behind a tractor, and it would pick the whole field. And then I was
Amazing.
like, oh.
Wait, that was an option?
Yeah. And it was like, oh, we don't have to work as much. It's like, no, we just have to do additional jobs. We just have to work, still have to work just as much.
Just as much. That's interesting. I did not know that rock picking was a universal farm thing, but I guess it makes sense.
Your brother probably has a rock picker thing that tows behind a Kubota and is solving the problems for Mostly
for that?
children, I think. Because I think rock picking was a
Mostly the child
Yeah.
labor issue with the rock picking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think-
they fixed that one.
I think it was mostly.
I'm so glad we bonded over this. Apparently, there's more of us out there.
You never know.
Picking rocks out of pastures. Yeah.
Yeah, it's totally a thing. So you didn't do that very long, though. That wasn't like you didn't choose that as a life.
That wasn't my career path.
Yeah, you weren't
No,
like.
I wasn't like, this is for me.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we still like have connections to farms and that whole community. I moved along though from Ontario, went to school in Quebec and Montreal, did grad school in New York, got my first real job in DC as a reporter covering clean energy and climate policy and politics, and got to cover a bunch of legislation on the Hill and get that whole world understood, riding the little train under the Capitol and kind of being thrown off the deep end as a Canadian, suddenly covering really closely American politics and policy. And that was at E&E News. And it was a great place to launch a career. And I think it's been quite a journey here. I've been living in the US for gosh, over a decade plus. Yeah, since 2010, so 14 years. So this is now my community, and I do it as a day job now, working on clean energy policy for a company called Good Leap, which is a technology company offering financing and software to the home sustainability space. So think like solar storage, heat pumps, EV chargers, drought-resistant landscaping, even that whole world. But I think, like everyone, your childhood experiences kind of morph what you do and where you go. And I think having sort of a connection to folks who worked with their hands and built stuff is sort of informs my opinion. Working now with contractors, I think preservation of natural environments is important to me, although I do think I'm really more of like an environmentalist who sees the economic opportunity, and that's really because I think I see a human prosperity opportunity and ways to have greater equality and future growth prospects and things that excite people and allow them to have better quality of life. And I think energy is at the center of that, not just like a little piece of it, but like pretty central. And so all of that I think kind of speaks to my roots in different ways, as probably does for everyone.
When you came to the States, were you already like a student of U.S. politics, or were you just like coming in and and like learning it all? I mean, kind of just like drinking from the fire hose, learning it all.
I mean, anytime you go to a different country and learn a different political system, like Canada has a parliamentary system and how Congress works here is very different. Don't go back and quiz me on how Canadian government works now, though. I mean, even though I do follow it very closely. But yeah, I had a lot to learn. I was a poli-sci undergrad and English literature, so kind of lent itself to becoming a journalist, where I sort of had the issues and then had sort of a background in writing and had long worked on journalism stuff going back to my high school paper and announcements and all that nerdy stuff. Just rock picking and doing the announcements, guys. I had no friends. So here we are. I have at least one, my husband. But no, so it totally lent itself to working in policy and politics. I kind of knew I wanted to go that realm. I really believe in the power of journalism, though. I could have stayed a journalist forever. Whole story for another podcast another time is what's happening in the journalism industry. Please subscribe to your local newspapers. I think it should be a rule that wherever you live, you have to at least subscribe and pay money for your local newspaper and keep that reporting, and then probably have like one national subscription as well. That should just be like our civic duty.
Seriously.
But that aside, thanks for hearing my TED Talk. Journalism gives you this great ability to get to know an industry, and having covered that space for over a decade in just my journalism career allowed me to kind of go into the private sector with a lot of knowledge of how policies work. People get influenced by different things, whether it's to grow a business, to have power and influence, to just be issues and sort of motivated by passion projects. It's sort of those three things. Like, what are you motivated by? Power, money, or doing good in the world? Those are kind of like oversimplified, but I think policy sits at the center of a lot of that. And even though a lot of people are not plugged into policy day to day, it's really wonky. We've learned, especially in recent years, you can't ignore it because it's really powerful, and we all kind of have a voice in it. And so journalism kind of feeds into that too. It is a responsibility to shine light on policy developments, hold our leaders accountable. So I always loved that. And now work on it in a different way of trying to actually make the change directly and deploy more of these clean energy solutions I've been writing about for so long.
Yeah. So I mentioned tools before, and I've never thought about policy as like a major tool in the toolkit. I was mentioning to Flo before we did this, I was like, I'm so nervous to like go in deep on policy because I'm like, I'm mostly thinking about, okay, what is it? Why is it there? What's it going to block? If that makes sense. It's like,
I love that block is what you went to.
Yeah. It's like, what is it?
Couldn't possibly enable anything.
Right, exactly. What is it going to stop us from doing? And I think some of that comes from like my upbringing on the farm, where it was like, if I can't pick up the rock and go do this, if I can't feed the cow, and like, if I don't have the absolute just one-to-one direct freedom to do these things, and there's anything I have to be thinking about in the back of my mind then it's like, I was sort of raised in that world where policy is limitation. On the farm, that's what it felt like. If there was something that like, I need to accomplish this job and there's this thing that I can't do now. And again, just voices around me. It wasn't me. It wasn't like, oh yeah, this is my doctrine. It just the voices around me from the people who were also working. It's like, government won't let us do this. And there was a lot of that talk of like, they're here to keep us down. And so moving into energy, I'm curious, like having grown up in that for you and then going into journalism, how could you, and you could just try to heal my childhood or something like that. How would you flip that around if you were met with somebody who said,
I charge $100 an hour for therapy. Yeah. Separate bill. No. Let me try to heal your childhood on policy. No, but I hear where you're going with that. And it's part of government's role is to create rules so we don't have this sort of lawless society, right? So that can feel like an infringement, but it's usually designed with a purpose in mind. We may not agree with those purposes. Of course, folks in power can create policies that do the bidding of one set of stakeholders or another. So that's why, again, I come back to like, go vote, engage, write letters, be engaged in the process. Because I think it's really easy to be like, policy doesn't affect me. But in reality, it does. It affects like our food systems. It affects our energy systems, things you may not be thinking about going about your daily life, but where you get your power from and what it costs. Let's just focus on that. Depending on where you live, like what you pay each month on your electricity bill is determined by a very small group of people. There's like 65-ish of them nationally in America, public utility commissions that determine what utilities can charge you. A lot of Americans don't think about the role of those specific individuals every day, but they wield an enormous amount of power. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. We're all pretty much required to pay to have electricity. And that's a process that's really opaque, frankly. You have to intervene and have regulatory lawyers to really engage in those procedures, which our trade groups do. But as an average individual, you got to actually show up to a hearing if and when those opportunities come up. And it's a pretty big, demanding process. But nonetheless, it's one of those things that you may not think about, but is really affecting your life. And that can feel like a limitation. You are getting power and a service for it, but I just point that out as one of those levers of power that, is with us every day and really does matter. It can also be really enabling, right? Like hopefully talk more in this episode about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, a massive federal bill that is going to accelerate clean energy adoption in major ways with some twists and turns. But that's a thing that policy enabled. It's going to enable more jobs, more onshoring of manufacturing of clean energy technologies in America, more prosperity, hopefully, if we maintain this policy for its intended lifetime and it doesn't get changed too dramatically. I think of policy as an essential. We need to make decisions. One of the things that piqued my interest early on in it, and I'd mentioned this to you in a quick, intro, is my grandfather was an engineer. He worked in construction, and he was just matter of fact. He loved reading all the newspapers every day. He was a Economist subscriber and like read it cover to cover every week, which is inhuman, but no one can read it week to week. It's a lot. But he was one of those guys who really did. And he would cut out little like clippings for me. And even when I went to university, he would like put them in old fashioned mail, like actual clippings of articles with little Post-its of like, this is important, and underline little pieces. And maybe that's also partially why I became a journalist. But he was just pointing out things. One of those articles was how the Canadian Coast Guard was going to have to think about budgets for more icebreakers in the north because the ice was starting to melt. It was very like matter of fact. It wasn't even talking about drivers of climate change or pace of climate change. It was just like, what is the Canadian government going to invest in dollars and cents in new icebreakers, knowing that we need a greater presence in the north now that ice is melting and these routes are opening up? How do we actually monitor that region of the world that's pretty inhospitable? There, right there, that's a policy decision. What is this country going to invest in real national security terms to protect our population for generations to come? you need policy to make those decisions. These are taxpayer dollars that need to be wielded in sensible ways. And it was so fascinating to me that climate change was just like feeding right into this very like nuts and bolts conversation about massive military ship that we were all going to pay for as taxpayers. And that's when I was like, oh, climate isn't just like, you know, a thing you can choose to kind of believe in or not. And, you know, if you want to hug a tree, great. But if not, don't. Like, our military is making strategic decisions around it. Our economies have to use energy. We know this. Where that energy comes from is absolutely pivotal. Obviously, Canada is a massively energy producing country in and of itself. So to me, that wasn't just like a side issue. It was, again, one of the big issues of our societies that allow people to grow and prosper, not to mention globally, where access to electricity is still not universal, and you have people delivering babies in the dark with limited access to like medical devices and care because we haven't hacked that one yet. So it's fundamental to our experience that we're on this little rotating planet. So that's, I think, what kind of draws me to it. I'm not a great environmentalist. I'm a good like humanist that like thinks energy is central to our human experience.
Yeah. It's interesting how like having the luxury of a long-term view, if you can think about the macro effects of climate change to humanity, like that's kind of a luxury to be able to think about that, because a lot of people are just thinking like, how am I going to feed my kids tonight? To your point of like just this matter of fact thing that is happening, we need to solve it. And I think sometimes like that's where a lot of that rub comes from, where people who have this luxury to think about these existential threats to humanity, they should be thinking about those and for sure like solving those issues. But there's the voters who are voting on these policies in many cases are just voting for like the grocery bill and the gas bill and are my lights on and do I have childcare and do I, you know, so it's these very like, Flo and I were talking about how like what's going on in Western North Carolina right now for the Eastern North Carolinians who have friends over there or, you know, like visit there often or spend a lot of time there, like it feels helpless because it's like there's these short-term, like real moment-to-moment things happening over there that there's like, they don't have a toolkit. They don't have
in the wake of Hurricane Helene hitting the state. Incredibly brutal. I think it's something like, I need to fact check this, but it's something on the order of Lake Tahoe's worth of water slammed into that region, right? Like a massive amount of water. Another, sad thing that maybe puts a point on the real brass tacks of climate change is, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act, this once in a generation bill that's going to change a lot of different aspects of the clean economy, authorized and appropriated around $370 billion. Just from that one storm, and just to date, because they haven't finally tallied it all up, the storm Hurricane Helene is going to cost $110 billion in damages. So you have this decade-long bill that's designed painstakingly with lots of stakeholders to set America on a path to really harness and boost the growth, manufacturing, deployment, all kinds of new technologies and clean energy, not to mention other healthcare and associated pieces of that bill. But that was $370 billion. That one storm just caused $110 billion of damage. Different metrics, obviously, but it puts it a little bit into context of like, man, this climate thing's costing us some real dollars. And we have to invest in mitigation. And there's a lot of what the IRA is focused on is more clean energy technologies to decarbonize. But at the same time, these storms remind us like the clock is ticking and we have to like both accelerate on mitigation as well as resilience and adaptation, because that bill is coming due too. And so we can't really afford not to, because that's really what people I think are going to engage with when it comes to climate is, what did that do to my backyard? And oh my gosh, my house is flooded. So that's really expensive. And by the way, something we do at Good Leap is like helping the whole home, and including even things like mold remediation in places that are affected by climate impacts. So anyway, it's just, that's the brass tacks. Whether or not the word climate ever comes up may not be relevant, but it is true that that's how a lot of humans' experience is going to be with climate change. Or again, their energy costs every month, or how they get around and access to transportation. And is it polluting and giving their child asthma? Like that's where the rubber hits the road. Our naval ships.
I haven't bought bottled water in years, and I bought a ton of bottled water to donate yesterday because it's just, it's a metal, what is it? Wheel hits the, what's the metaphor? Something hits the road.
Rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
Metal hits the road.
Rubber hits the road.
Rubber
Yeah.
hits the road.
Like,
Yeah.
situation where, I don't love buying bottled water, but people are desperate for clean water. And we didn't ever think that the mountains would be hit by a hurricane in this way. And so we weren't prepared,
Yeah, we were talking before.
Tools.
Yeah, we were talking before this about like that. Again, going back to the toolkit, it's just like what in your point about resilience. Like, there's just, if you don't have the policy toolkit, you don't have the financial toolkit, like what GoodLeap is providing to homes. If you don't have, I guess, the technological toolkit in some cases, but a lot of times, like in energy and water and all this, it really is like money and policy, and those are very tightly linked. Those two things.
Yes.
Right. And it's like, I think people miss that, especially like, I've spent most of my career interfacing with like venture capitalists, and a lot of times those pieces get missed. Not so much anymore. I think there's enough, like there are now like climate focused VCs who are really doing the work to be like, what actually needs to be here. And even a VC, which I think pretty well, who is actually linked policy to their venture capital firm. Like it's sort of one.
Yes.
Is that it might even, does your co-host of your podcast, does he work there?
Yeah, Brandon Hurlbutt, Overture VC.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's an example of like, these were political policy people who worked at the DOE and elsewhere, who've since grown a government relations firm, but separately created a venture capital firm that, understands and puts policy at the heart of it, knowing that that's going to mobilize and make possible new business models that America's really leaning into for the first time. So why not have that at the heart of your venture capital strategy? In the past, I think private industry thought, oh, you're too policy reliant. That's all risk. But also, not that there's no risk, there certainly is, but it's also yours for the taking. Like if you learn how to utilize government tools and apply for that grant, get that grant, it could get a new business model started in America that maybe one of our competitors is already working on, but we really want to invest in further. The one thing that's the most bipartisan thing out there today is like competition with China and being anti-China, on Congress. That's pretty much the one of the issues that everyone comes together on, and supporting more business in America, making in America, and I think IP in America. And so that's one way government can help get new ideas going, because the private sector is not really ready to step in until you sort of cross that valley of death, as they call it. So a new startup concept has to kind of go through this development cycle of maybe coming from a lab, getting tested in the real world, having pilots, reaching demonstration level, then reaching scale, right? And there's a lot of different twists and turns in that journey. I used to work with New Energy Nexus, a startup accelerator, and it was fascinating to see the entrepreneurs with so many interesting ideas and tweaks on technologies or new software solutions, but getting to scale is challenging. And that's where other countries have government step in to have targeted programs or funding mechanisms available to help get us those companies to the next level, so that the private sector can step in and help scale from there. But you do need that, somewhat of a strategic plan to enable that if you want those industries to grow in, within your borders. So it's great to see the U.S. is, I think, being more proactive on that front. Great to see venture capitalists starting to engage more in policy, because I think it can help support the businesses they support. But let me say, as a whole, I think clean energy is still woefully under invested in policy and also the political process. I know there's a lot of money in politics. It's not like a savory topic, right? Citizens United, separate issue for a separate time. But it is true that if you don't get to know your political leaders and help elect leaders that understand the industry and are curious to know more, then you can't be surprised if you don't end up with policies at any level of government that didn't, at least be open to new business models in the clean energy industry. So voting matters, knowing who you're being researched on, who you're voting for, having a chance to interact with them, invite a politician to your next ribbon cutting, have them tour your lab, have them see the projects in action. It helps have our decision makers be better decision makers, right? When they're writing massive energy bills or working on streamlining permitting, as they are right now in Congress at the federal level, what does that look like? What's going to really make it easier to build in America? They have to see and feel that. And so I think companies need to engage more in the not only policy process, that being traditional lobbying on, say, a bill, but also the political process of getting to know someone outside the context of one piece of legislation, supporting someone at a fundraiser. Again, money in politics is not super savory. We know how industries, influence through that mechanism, but it's also true that we, as an industry, have been to fundraisers where we can't even scrape together like $10,000, $15,000 to support someone who's a major climate champion. And so I think that's a little unfortunate because that person may lose their seat next time, just given the realities that they need to like campaign and have some money to do so. So I encourage folks to lean in more on the policy and political side too.
Actually, so our last guest was Ryan Kushner from the accelerator Third Derivative.
Yes, I know Ryan. He's the best.
He is the best. I hung out with him in San Francisco. That's where I met him. One of my main questions for him was, they're doing a lot of grid augmentation startups, like battery augmentation for car charging in parking lots that you can plug into the local electric power grid. And I was just so curious to hear, how do you scale that when there's a lot of conversation around utilities being not very proactive about modernizing and improving the grid, like bringing an innovation into their infrastructure network. And one of the conversations Greg and I have talked a lot about is just incentives and how difficult it can be to change the way things are when it's like kind of a monolithic structure. I love that you're talking about getting government involved because in a lot of ways our power utilities are sort of part of the government. And there's they're small,
regulated.
Small,
IOUs are regulated monopolies. And even your local government will have a governance structure. If it's a municipal utility, they'll still have a board or something to answer to. So I think the point there is policy is already happening. Utilities are very engaged in policy. They have to be. That's they are entirely regulated or regulated in various ways. So which is part of the challenge, right? Is how do you as a maybe entrepreneur or startup in the sector influence a pretty complex and frankly expensive process when it comes specifically to utilities and engaging on the regulatory front. That's where the regulation couples with the legislation. And if you can set rules of the road through law that then regulators have to respond to, that's another way to engage and say, hey, let's pass a 100% clean energy bill, as you've seen states do. And you set that kind of high level goal at the legislative level, and then you can have the conversations on how that works on the regulatory side. But it's a whole thing. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. And and being innovative in the energy industry overall can be challenging because energy is kind of an inherently risk-averse sector, right? We want people to have consistent access to power. Utilities are old businesses that aren't the most innovative all the time. So certainly can make it harder to deploy new solutions in that context. But that's, again, why we have to educate decision makers on why it's so key and really beneficial to economies and society.
Yeah, I'm curious about the work you're doing at Good Leap. It's an interesting dilemma when the customer profile of a utility changes so drastically. They've been regulated, and the reason they earned that monopoly status was because they would serve everybody sort of equally. And now Good Leap and anybody in this space since 2010 has been going to these residential customers and saying, change who you are as a customer to the utility. You're going to either add solar, you're going to add batteries, or you're going to add, an electric car. It's you're radically changing that customer profile, and you're sort of fragmenting the customer profile for the utility. The utility is looking at you and saying, wait a minute, no, you're weird. And I've got 3 different types of customers. It's starting a business, or especially a venture-backed business, is the whole point is to have one type of customer and just focus on that. Because that's, if you have many types, it just gets too complicated. And so I'm curious, as you're working on policy with utilities, how challenging is that to talk a utility into more fragmentation of their buyer profile? Or do you not really have to do that?
Yeah, the whole prosumer trend of consumers actually becoming producers of power through adopting things like solar and storage. Look, utilities are smart. They have their own programs that leverage assets at the distribution grid level. So I have zero concern that utilities can't do complicated things. Rates themselves are very complicated. In California, there's already multiple rate classes for different types of consumers at different, we have time of use rates here. We have electrification rates here. Utilities know how to do rate structures. I have no concern with that. I think the core of the issue is less about can a utility manage a complexity than it is around are utilities being properly incentivized to do innovative things. And that includes, we don't have performance-based rate making in most places, where the utilities evaluated whether or not they had really good service and met a set of targets like decarbonization, like reliable power. You could evaluate a utility based on those metrics, not just we decided you can make 5% on whatever amount of money you put in. That 5% seems reasonable, the end of conversation. What if that became a more multifaceted conversation and there were other metrics that were easily understood that evaluated performance? I think that's one of the things that would help make sure utilities are incentivized to do new things that may seem more complicated. But the utilities themselves propose really interesting and somewhat complicated rates. Like in North Carolina, where you guys are based, there's a two-part evolution of net metering for residential solar customers in that state that has a battery program attached to it with multiple elements to the battery program, one where the utility has some control of the battery, one where they don't. That was decided in conjunction with the utility. Like, they had no problem coming up with a new plan. We all had to figure out, it's frankly quite challenging for industry to figure out how to utilize those programs, because then we had to run that through our economic models. Can you even make things pencil in that environment? So I think it mostly comes down to business. For better, for worse, utilities are not incentivized to see demand drop. That includes with something like solar and storage, but frankly, even with efficiency. If you're buying less of their product, it's not great for them. Depends a bit on how they're regulated. So that incentive structure is already set up to not meet some of our climate goals, because we're kind of wanting people to consume more unless there's some other metric the utility is being held to, or they're mandated by, say, a state law to meet 100% clean. So yeah, the conversations are tough. They are complicated. They're totally doable. I think a principle has to be, how do we continue to have multiple businesses and entrepreneurs who are deploying the solutions, who are closest to the customers, be able to grow and thrive? Because we know monopolies, utilities really struggle to provide more nuanced services. They've tried in some cases and hasn't really worked. But how do we work in conjunction with them to make sure they're also made whole and incentivized appropriately to run fair programs? I think one of the most exciting areas here is virtual power plants. How do you start to actually aggregate those consumers who produce their own power and can shift when they use power from something as simple as adjusting their thermostat at certain times of day, all the way to, using their own stored battery power, or even export their own battery power back to the grid? How do we leverage those in ways that meet utility needs when there's strain on the grid, and compensate those customers fairly for that service that they provide? Again, by aggregating hundreds of those users into what becomes effectively a single big power plant that the utility can call upon, just like they would a big natural gas peaker plant or something of that nature. I think that's kind of shifting the dialogue a little bit from just like, what is a customer taking off of, or what is a customer doing that causes friction with the traditional business model for utilities, versus how is a customer actually part of a network of solutions that help the whole grid perform better for everybody, and hopefully lower costs too.
Cool. I feel like I understand virtual power plants now. I wouldn't want to admit it, but I didn't really understand what it was. And now I do. So thank you.
You're not alone. There's been some polling that shows people are like, virtual what? But it's literally what it is. Like, imagine a big power plant. Yep. You can actually basically replicate that with a software signal that tells a bunch of customers in their homes to do something at one time, which, by the way, they can always opt out of. But we're getting to a place where now, how do you ensure that that's something the utilities can count on? And there's a lot of exciting work around doing that in ways that, like, there's all kinds of services that virtual power plants can offer, either helping meet peak demand or frequency. I shouldn't go into the technical stuff, but there's all kinds of services that virtual power plants can offer. So making sure that the virtual power plants can perform those at the right time, and maybe even help offset future investments in the grid itself. Like, do you really need to build a whole new power plant, or do you need to pay for a bunch of natural gas peaker plants to sit around in case of emergency? If actually you knew with certainty you could tap on the shoulder of a few hundred customers and have them meet that need with existing infrastructure. There's real dollars exchanged there. In California, we are paying, just for the course of like 2 or 3 years, $1.2 billion in California to keep a bunch of natural gas peaker plants available just in case we need them during hot days. That's real money. again, and we may never ever need to use them, but we had to sign an agreement with those power plants to keep that capacity available. And so there's real trade-offs there. What if we actually just tapped on the shoulder of some of our customers and got them to lower demand or shift demand in a way that actually met the grid need, and then we didn't have to call on those peaker plants, which is not only saving money, but hey, we didn't have to fire up a bunch of gas plants.
So I could get solar and a battery and contribute to the resilience of the power grid in my neighborhood when needed.
Yeah, if a virtual power
cool.
plant program exists, which goes back to the policy point and why we have policy work to do to show that we should create these programs, and there's certain principles we want in those programs, but they are very much policy enabled. And it's exciting to see not only utilities, but the regulators lean in more, and we as service providers in the space, which GoodLeap's now active in the VPP space, have our work cut out for us too. But I think of it as a very exciting new evolution of that kind of like more tense discussion you were teeing up, Greg, about the prosumers and what does it mean for utilities. But we may be sort of shifting the dialogue there as this whole grid edge discussion evolves. There's clearly value at the grid edge. We know it because in California, a couple years ago, there was a text message sent out in a panic saying, everybody, please turn down your thermostats. That was our plan to keep the world's fifth largest economy from having a massive blackout. It was like, it was like one of those missing persons alerts. Like our phones all went off with this alarm, like turn down the thermostat. Really blunt way of doing it. We have much better ways of doing it with technology, with software, and we can meet those grid needs. And that's an extreme case, but we can do it every day in multiple different ways in every region of the country.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the virtual power plant thing has always been like, to me, such like a simple, elegant solution to, especially in like municipal power company districts or co-ops where it's like they're paying so much money to like call them like out of towners. There's like these gas plants out of town. And there's these coal plants out of town, and there's these nuke plants out of town, and they're just collecting bills from their in-towners and sending them to the out-of-towners. And it's like 95%. And then there's crazy demand charges on their grids. And it's like, but you could solve all of that as a muni or a co-op by just going to like your farmers or your others and saying, hey, I could avoid X amount of dollars in like demand charges annually if I had this much capacity, or if I could build here. Going back to rate policy, this is where I'm not completely up to speed on. There might have been some policy that required these co-ops or these munis to buy from a generation and transmission company or something out of town. But so there may be a policy shift.
Yeah.
But the point is, like with co-ops, it's like you have a board, or a muni, you have a board, and it's usually pretty small. But if you could make money, again, you went over it pretty quickly, but I think it's important to double click on the fact that these utilities get a certain amount of profit when they spend money.
Right.
And if they could
guaranteed
make
rate of return.
Yeah, guaranteed rate. So if they could make more money by buying, like maybe they could buy services from their local grid participants or their customers, if they could buy services and put a larger margin on top of the services they buy locally, then they would make more money. So like their shareholder, like if you're an investor on utility, like your shareholders would make more money. You'd drive more shareholder value if you bought from local, if you bought inside your network versus outside your network. Like if you bought from inside your distribution, inside your control area versus outside, that would be always.
Well, those are the numbers that have to be crunched, and why you have to get into the weeds a little bit. And it is regional, and it depends on the existing laws for sure. But yeah, there's definitely ways, and there's a really great Department of Energy liftoff report on virtual power plants that if you're at all interested in, encourage people to go check out. That really lays out the multiple ways VPPs can operate, which by the way, it's not just homes. It could be businesses that are aggregating their demand. So it can be at the CNI level as well. But yeah, it really has to map onto that, whether or not it works in the scenario you're describing. People would have to get in there with pencils and figure it out. But it's a real opportunity because it's already happening. Texas is one of the states where virtual power plants are being leveraged the most. So in California as well. So there's no politics really. It's just like a service provided to the grid. And we can't sleep on the fact that different technologies connected to the distribution grid, that local level, really have a key role to play. And I know you've had some guests on the show in the past who've talked about some of the local energy benefits. I think of it also in the context of, again, climate, how we kind of started our conversation. 42% of emissions come from decisions made in the home, per Rewiring America, or an organization that works a lot on accelerating heat pump and other electrification technologies. When they crunch the numbers, it's again decisions. So that would include the car you choose to drive, how you choose to cook your food, where you get your power from, all those things. While individuals aren't the only actors that are relevant in addressing climate change, we need systems change. But the decisions we do make, again, aggregated together, have a big impact on energy-related emissions. And so I'm like, we of course need to harness what happens at the local, most closest to the homeowner perspective, because we actually have a big influence on carbon emissions, not to mention our daily lives. Like if you choose to, say, put solar on your roof, you may save some real money. If you choose to drive an EV, you may meaningfully reduce local pollution in your community that's harming children. You're being part of the puzzle and also probably getting some real benefits. Whether that's resilience, whether that's energy cost savings, peace of mind during a power outage, it can take a lot of different forms.
Yeah. And policy is just so fragmented when you talk about this stuff. Like when you talk about I was just talking to my brother who he has a municipal power company where he lives, and we did the math on it. It's only like 50 megawatts peak. Like that's their peak consumption of their entire muni. And it's like that, to me, that seems like low hanging fruit for some of these policies. It's like you've got 50 megawatts and you have like quite a few people. It's mostly residential. You have a handful of commercial, like maybe warehouses or something, but very clearly with that type of demand, you're not talking about a smelting plant or something like that in your region versus a Duke Energy, where it's like, no, they have like chip manufacturers and massive customers.
Well, that's why all this is so important too, because America's now seen electricity demand grow for the first time in like 2 decades. We were on this like kind of decline. Efficiency measures had helped us sort of like stay about neutral, even as the economy grew. We kind of decoupled economic growth from emissions and from load demand growth. But now that's changing with onshoring of manufacturing, these high energy intensity industries with crypto and AI, these high energy users. We're back into the mode of like, okay, we need more electrons, and we need to leverage everything, every tool in the toolkit to make sure we can not only meet that demand, but meet it in smarter ways so there isn't more strain on the infrastructure itself at various times of day, because that becomes not only the risks of like bluntly like blackouts and things of that nature, but it becomes very costly. So how do we make sure that's done in an equitable way? I think also the last thing I'll say on distribution grid, DERs, distributed energy resources, and why I think it's exciting is going back to my sort of passion for policy and politics and playing a key role. It's what a great way to see how like an individual can benefit directly from the clean energy transition, which can feel lofty. Like, what does that mean? Clean energy transition. No one's got like a ticker, I don't think, of like, oh, we're at this phase of the energy transition now. Like our economy hit this level or that. But you can feel it in a real way if, say, as over 3.4 million people did last year, so you get a tax credit. Like that's what was enabled by the IRA. The Treasury reported it out. 3.5 million taxpayers that year alone got some kind of home efficiency, electrification, or clean energy benefit on their personal tax returns. That doesn't even include folks who use maybe a lease or a PPA to put solar on their roof. It's just individuals who choose to own the system. That's a lot of people. It's actually double what the that's actually double what the IRS was expecting. So it's a good chunk of people who got like $8 billion plus back in their pockets. So I'm like, that's cool, because those are voters. Those are everyday Americans who, have other priorities in life. And energy is one of those fixed costs. We call it energy burden, actually, how so many Americans have to pay X amount every month. And for especially the lower income communities, they pay a disproportionate amount of what they earn on energy because it is that fixed cost they can't really get away from. So how do we find ways to lower that? And I love that working at the homeowner and like local business level allows you to really see and feel the impact of energy decisions, and policy can really provide some great benefits there when we structure it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I have a couple of questions about the IRA, but I want to make one point about how you said that energy demand is now going up for the first time in 20 years. It's like there's so many of these things that are happening right at this moment that are totally changing the energy conversation. Like talking about energy transition implies that we're going from this state to this other state. Whereas now we have all this new demand where it's like, well, that has an opportunity to reinvent because it's it's expanding. It's all new. It's net new. So we can say, well, maybe we don't serve gigantic industrial customers the same way we served them the first time around. Like maybe it could be redesigned. Maybe it could have a different design to it.
Stay hopeful. See, look at you. We're healing your childhood traumas. Policy is not a stick in the mud always, not a barrier entirely. Look at you being innovative. How could policies change to enable better business models? I love it.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of this work for the last like 20 years, but my facial hair is getting really gray in the process. So
I'm with you.
So, but then the other thing that's really interesting, if we think about the financial products, is like the other thing that has changed radically just in this sort of moment is like money costs something. Money costs something now. Like it didn't really cost something for the last 20 years. We kind of were in the zero interest rates
were low.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Interest rates.
Which, by the way, if you talk to like, I don't know, folks who were around in the 80s, like interest rates were way higher than they even are now. So it's kind of like, I mean, I am not a Fed expert, but they seem to have thread the needle, and we'll see where it goes from here, but they thread the needle fairly well in trying to reduce inflation while not skyrocketing interest rates, and also while not throwing us into a recession. Jury's still out on whether we land the ship, but so far we've sort of skated through it, but doesn't mean that people aren't feeling real impacts from higher interest rates. And yes, the cost of capital goes up as a result, which can slow deployment of clean energy along with any other business, just because it's harder it's more expensive to operate.
And Greg, what do you call it? Bankability, the spreadsheets?
Yeah. Well, just like making projects, clean energy projects bankable. I mean, that's been like my whole career, it's just like you go into a project, and I think the first PPA I was ever a part of was like 28 cents a kilowatt hour, which is like, hey guy that just graduated from college, like make sure this is bankable. And it's like, I did the math. It's not.
That's a no for me.
It was just so high, but yeah, with all of these different policies and such, that it's been able to help us bring it down. It's wild to see some of
the international ones, like Abu Dhabi. What have they had PPAs at? Like we're talking cents?
Cents. Less than 2 cents. Yeah.
Less than 2 cents, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I think...
But it's thanks to your work. See, you paved the road for cost decline.
And those are power purchase agreements, right?
Power purchase agreements, yeah. Sorry about that.
No.
Yeah, so speaking of other acronyms, Inflation Reduction Act. We don't have to spend too much time on what it's called.
Yeah, we do. We have a lot to say. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it.
We don't have to spend much on the Inflation Reduction Act part of it. But curious about like just if you can just, even from the Good Leap perspective, what are the programs that created that has kind of allowed Good Leap to, or enabled or supported Good Leap's work?
Yeah. So on the residential side, I mentioned those tax credits that individuals can benefit from. So that's if you choose to pay cash to get solar and storage, or purchase, say, a more efficient or electric air conditioner, other insulation and efficiency benefits. Things like that are supported by two buckets of the residential tax credits when the customer owns it. So that's the 8 billion / 3.5 million customers I was talking about. Many of those are our customers that we help make that purchase with a loan, where again, the customer owns the system, but they used a loan to purchase it. Then we recently got into the third-party ownership model. So that's those PPAs you're talking about and leases, again, in the residential sector. You were talking there about larger scale projects you were working on. But we offer that as an option for customers to purchase solar and storage on their home and have us continue to own it and provide the operations and maintenance. And then you as the customer still get, either lower, you contract for a power price that's typically cheaper than your utility, or you're leasing the panels and again, still getting those energy bill savings or at least certainty. So that whole ecosystem of third-party owned TPO systems has a range of policies in the IRA that help drive that business model. So you have, in both scenarios, a core 30% tax credit that their customer gets on their own tax return, or in this TPO case, the company gets, and can pass through to the customer in various ways. Plus, there are 10% bonus tax credits for systems deployed in what are called energy communities, traditionally fossil fuel communities next to coal plants and other definitions of those regions. And it's actually a lot of America, huge swaths of even California, Texas, places that you think of as being, greener, but there's a lot of legacy fossil fuel infrastructure there. And these are communities that have typically been impacted by that pollution for generations. So the concept is, let's make sure they're the first to benefit from these cleaner solutions. So that's 30% plus 10% bonus tax credit for that energy community, plus an additional 10% if you are using domestically made products to deploy your system. So you could be looking at a 50% tax credit for these TPO projects in some cases if they can comply with all the requirements. And so that's huge. Domestically made products are probably going to be a little more expensive. That's why we have the tax credit, to encourage not only the making of those facilities and making of the products in America, but then this tax credit I'm talking about is on the deployment side. How do you encourage people to actually deploy those in the real world? So that's part of the whole story of how do we make and build in America. That tax credit's a piece of that puzzle. So we, along with everyone else, is looking at how do we best leverage that? How do we get the right products compiled together then in a compliant way to actually meet the threshold to qualify for that tax credit? And it's just really exciting to see how we're part of the story of, like, again, build it in America, deploy it in America, and maybe even deploy it abroad once we really get these supply chains rocking and rolling. And so I think American consumers can feel good too, that they're buying a product that was maybe made down the road or in a neighboring state. Like, that's where we're going here in the near term. So those are just a couple pieces of the puzzle. There's also a tax credit for $1,000 for homeowners to get an EV charger that we look at. There's a bunch of home energy and efficiency rebates coming down the pike that various states are going to roll out state by state. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a big $28 billion fund that somehow miraculously they got entirely deployed. So appropriated through the bill and then out the door to recipients by the 2-year anniversary of the IRA. That's very fast for government to work. And that's one of the biggest single allocations, if not the biggest ever, this $28 billion to support various type of local clean energy programs. One of those will be to support heat pumps and solar and storage. So we're working on looking at that. And is that an opportunity for us to seize? So there's at least 5 or 6 buckets right there of IRA related programs that I think will have a meaningful impact. Not to mention workforce training, some consumer education efforts. There's also a novel use of a national security related provision to make more heat pumps in America. It's only about $50 million is being used, but it's actually using the Defense Production Act to say that's actually a national imperative to make more of this technology here. So that's just a new and interesting way they're incentivizing manufacturers to make the technologies of the next generation. So we're not just importing it from other countries.
Gosh, I feel like everything you just said is just falls under that individual empowerment category, which is typically not the main rhetoric in the clean energy, in the climate space or the clean energy space. It's typically the people sort of, it's the rhetoric for people a lot of times historically, at least, fighting against those policies. But there's so much of this that's helping out the local electrician to be able to add new products on their shelf. They're not just having to go answer calls for the broken, HVAC system or the panel or whatever.
Well, I do want to note that these programs I talk about do have to be implemented well, or else we won't actually see all the benefits. And that's, I think, we're still very much in that phase. Tax credits are kind of easier because they're available or they're not. That's kind of understood. When it comes to more rebates and novel types of structures, most people do replace their HVAC once it's broken. So it's hard to have a discussion in that real moment when maybe the baby's crying and it's hot outside and, to say, hey, let me pitch you in a radically different technology that maybe you're not familiar with. This heat pump thing that also cools. Yeah. They're like, what? Yeah. I just want to make it fix it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hot. So we do have to get better in thinking about how existing business models work and empowering those contractors to have more nuanced conversations and not make it so hard to access the rebate, because these are more expensive technologies. Oftentimes, just sticking with the heat pump example, can be almost double a traditional gas-powered air conditioner. So you actually need the rebate to make it work. But if we make it so hard to even access the rebate, there's tons of paperwork to be filed and delays. The contractor can't front that money, and maybe the customer, doesn't have the money on hand to get the more expensive product. So how these programs are implemented is actually super key. So I don't want to gloss over that, even though there's a really great story to tell with the IRA. The success or failure of it in some cases will come down to implementation here.
Yeah. And is Good Leap, do you spend a lot of your time thinking about that, I'm assuming? company.
We spent a lot of time thinking about that. We're obviously looking at the election and like, what could that mean? You know, are there going to be changes to the IRA? So everyone sort of spun up new business models, not new business models, but found ways to, you know, leverage the tools of the law. But so that law could change. You know, we've seen 18 Republicans come out and say they don't want to see the IRA repealed, which is really consequential because no matter how the election goes, it'll be very close in Congress. And so a few votes can actually make a big difference in changing or not changing something. And the administration matters too, because I mentioned implementation and that domestic content bonus tax credit, that additional 10% you can get for using American made products, which by the way also exists for big, large scale projects too, that 10%. It's not just residential. That we don't have final guidance on how that tax credit works. These are some boring policy terms here, final guidance, I get it, but point being, you need rules of the road of what you have to do to access that credit. And that's governed by the Treasury Department. They put out preliminary guidance, but this is a question mark depending on if there's a Republican in the White House. They could choose to change that guidance. They could make it a lot more challenging to utilize, put a lot more uncertainty in the system to the extent that no one can really count on the credit because we're not quite sure how to comply for it. So that could render that whole 10% bonus, unworkable depending on what a different administration decided to do, if they decided to touch it at all. I'm not saying they would. It's just one of those question marks of what does this all mean going forward? What are the policies that will exist or we'll have to continue working on? Because they will affect our businesses in real ways.
That's a really cool example of something you wouldn't know unless you work in politics.
Yeah, you might not be following the final guidance timeline on the Treasury Department's bonus tax credit for domestic content.
As with everything, there's always nuance to how things actually get done and applied, and where there's always variety of power levers that might not be obvious, and the administration overseeing the Treasury Department and how that's implemented is a lever of power I hadn't thought about before. So that's super interesting.
Right. Which will be guided by higher level things that folks will be familiar with, like how much do we want made in America? Well, what that looks like really matters. Are we saying that a solar project can't have one single screw with metal made from outside of America, or one single component that's made outside of America? Or are we saying, okay, no, if it's met a certain threshold of made in America, we're comfortable with that. Okay, what's that threshold? What's that percentage? Mm-hmm. That's where we get until the rubber hits the road, our new famous favorite line. That's where you get down to the rock picking. Exactly. Maybe we can make that line a thing of how these policies work and fundamentally what it actually means for real projects in the real world. And are we deploying clean energy at a greater scale or not?
Yeah. It's like food systems are like that, right? It's like, oh, cool that you have organic on the bag, but what is that? What percentage of ingredients has to be that in order to be called that? It's like,
oh, geez, I never even thought about that. Oh, you're ruining my life. I just figured organic was organic. We're good to go. I feel great. Let's move on.
Yeah, there's just some hard to reach ingredients that are only 1%, and it's like, are you gonna throw out the whole thing just for that one deal? We won't get into that.
Incremental is important.
Yeah.
I always keep in mind this panning out here on climate stuff of incrementalism to me is important because it's not okay, if the world warms 6 degrees, if we only reduced global warming by 1 degree from the 6 down the line, it's all over. No, that 1 degree of additional warming could mean exponentially more damage to the planet. So I always keep in mind that even if we don't hit the ultimate goal of, say, limiting emissions, by mid-century or the end of the century, every incremental amount we do avoid is potentially massive catastrophic levels of damage and impact on human lives avoided. And so I think about that when it comes to individual solutions too. Incrementally more, even if it's not perfect, is part of the transition. It's part of the world changing world change we're trying to create, to speak to your podcast title. Change doesn't always have to be wholesale. It can be incremental. It can be slow. It can be annoying. It can involve final guidance timelines. But it's all part of making it happen. If you agree that whether you like it or not, change is coming to our economies, to our energy systems. And this is us trying to get ahead of it in both a decarbonized way, and I think in a way that benefits America and our allies. To go back to my initial motivator of national security, I think it's, again, central to that story too.
Yeah. And there's no, you're saying, even in the products that GoodLeap is offering or others are offering, offering ways to move away from fossil fuels doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive program from making us more resilient against the change. Like you're talking about drought resistance. I'm sure, being able to fix mold, like those are all reactions to the reality. They're not all this sort of like, it's not like this altruism, let's save the planet. Like they can all go together, us like being able to like create a resilience against the change. But then also, to your point, even if we drop 1 degree, but we gain resilience against 5 degrees, like that can all be the same movement. It doesn't have to be a choice between, between limiting or just becoming resilient against it. So
yeah,
love
speed
that.
and scale matter, but as long as we're kind of moving forward, we have to speed and scale at the heart of it. And little teasers, once the election's over, I think you're going to have even more kind of, you have even more enthusiastic debates, even among people who largely agree. I think a lot of folks in the clean energy community have kind of parked some of their other debates around, okay, fracking or no fracking. You're seeing Kamala Harris really come out and say, actually, I'm in support of fracking. Pretty wild that the climate community has not come up in arms and been like, whoa, that could really lock in emissions for generations to come. And even if, natural gas burns cleaner, the pipeline systems and fugitive emissions and all these things, we kind of parked that, I think, right now. And maybe it's an acknowledgement that in this new era of demand growth, we do need to bring back and dust off that all of the above phrase that the Obama administration came up with. Or maybe there's, again, going to be more debates to come, but we're kind of in this like holding pattern until we get to the other side of the election. And then depending on what the future looks like, advocates will go from there. But I do think it's going to be an ongoing debate around how much fossil fuels will remain in the mix, to what extent. I think anyone would tell you they'll be around for a long time to come. It's a question of how and where and at what scale, and if we're also going to capture those emissions. And we're talking about a lot of big things, but I think it goes again to speak to why policy is going to be at the heart of so much of the energy discussions for forevermore, and encourage folks to get again engaged in as wonky or as high level as you want to. But there's room for everyone in this community, I think, to tell the stories of what they're doing to change the world, and make sure that decision makers know about that too.
Agreed. Well, I have other questions I'm going to leave for next time, maybe after the election or something like that. We'll have another conversation and see how this goes. But I just want to I can't believe how fast an hour went by. So this has been amazing.
It really flew. Wow. Did I say anything of interest? I feel like I
said,
just...
oh my God. I was like, soundbite.
So many things.
Oh, good. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm opining on a lot of things here, covering a lot of ground.
You're killing it.
Good. I always ask this question. I think you may have even touched on it, but just because I always ask at the end of every show, what happened when you were a kid? It could be something you got, an experience you had that I guess sort of has like been a guiding, or it has set you on the path of, all the way through. It could be journalism, or like even leading you to today where you're helping kind of empower those individuals by helping on policy at Good Leap.
Yeah. Well, I didn't realize rock picking had been so influential in my life until we had this conversation. I think, gosh, I mean, do you think pieces about, if I say like, well, I think we talked about some of the influence from my grandfather and those Economist articles. We talked about growing up on a farm, and again, my brother still being close to that community where like energy efficiency mandates for tractors has a real impact on farmers' lives. So like that's again where you see the rubber hit the road. All of those things really matter. I think honestly, one of the things that probably dawned on me was growing up after, seeing 9/11 happen, growing up and reaching the workforce after the Great Recession. I think like a lot of people started to think a lot about just where we sit in the world, and it kind of like opened my eyes to not just wanting to do something with my life that was like a job, but that I wanted my job to be like the thing that I did in life to make an impact. And so I think just stepping back at a higher level of like, why do I care about all this wonky stuff we've been talking about? I think I became aware at an earlier age, like a lot of folks in my generation, the millennial crew, of like our impact on the world. And yes, we use reusable mugs. And yes, we ride bicycles and it's not so bad. There's a whole article I remember about, those millennials keep drinking fair trade coffee and riding their bikes. And I'm like, is that a bad thing? And I think I'm in that crew of people who became somewhat aware and trying to be conscious about what my role is in it. I always loved being a journalist because like that was a tool I could bring to the table. I can't tell a community what they need in their community, but I could amplify the voices of those community members. I think about adopting that kind of mentality even in the policy work I do today. So I think those are some of those big historic moments that probably influenced why I work in clean energy and climate issues and wanting to make a positive impact for humanity, knowing that we live in a crazy world. And I want to have my little piece of it, hopefully be a positive impact, whatever form that takes.
Yeah, well, the tool of policy or, having the podcast audience or building all of that, like those are all like great tools to achieve that. I love your story about your grandpa and The Economist. I think that's like when I sort of imagine where you were and you've got this like grandparent that's like pulling out Economist articles that he's like reading out a weekly. I'm just imagining it's like,
totally.
Grandpa,
It's like
I gotta
such a
fill the
grandpa
bucket.
thing.
I gotta fill the bucket with rocks. Like I don't think I can. I think I could do the.
Give me Economist articles later, Grandpa. Another thing from my childhood I think of is, one of my uncles worked in the oil industry. Actually, a lot of my family still does surveying in the oil sands area of Canada. And so when it comes to like, why did I even go on to launch a podcast, which still hosts today, Political Climate, that has a Democrat and Republican, and we have these sort of like coming together conversations, not because we find kumbaya, but because we all live together as a community and have to find paths forward in like real ways, not to debate climate science, but like, okay, what are we going to do about our energy security? What are we going to do about decarbonization? And so growing up, I think, with people who had different motivations and backgrounds and thought they were also really having a positive impact in the world. Getting people affordable energy is a thing that motivates a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry. Or my brother, who again sells tractors and is trying to support farmers and our food sources and really loves the technology. Having exposure to people who just are all part of different facets of the economy, I think was an eye-opener for me and continues to motivate me today of like, how do we make sure that these solutions work for everyone and not just disparage people who oppose it on the face? Maybe understand why. Why does this not work for somebody? Why are they in opposition to this? It doesn't mean you always find common ground. But if you don't ask that question, I think you just end up putting up echo chambers and barriers, and then that stalls progress. Whereas going back to incrementalism, maybe, step by step, we start to find avenues where we can work together. And that kind of mentality, I think, has been seeped into me from an early age.
Amazing. Cut.
Love that.
Yay! Maybe that was better than 9/11, but I'm being honest.
Yeah.
They're both, it's hard to find one.
You can cut the 9/11 one.
It's hard to find the one moment, I'm sure I can think of 3 to 5 moments that really impacted me growing up. But where can people find you, Julia? Where do you want them to find you? Online.
473. No, I'm kidding. My address. Where can they find? So folks can find me. I'm on X, Twitter, at JM Pyper, Pyper. Political Climate's on there at Polly, POLI_climate. If you want to check out that podcast I mentioned. I'm also on LinkedIn. Totally welcome people to reach out there. Send me a message. But yeah, love to connect with everyone, and so glad that you guys invited me on. I hope this was worthwhile.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Thanks so much, Julia. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the World Changing Podcast. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts: iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, to hear the latest episodes.